remains this mystery that's at the very heart of the origin of our nation. People remain fascinated by Roanoke because we know so little about the place.
Long before the story hardened into myth, the colony on Roanoke Island lived through a quiet unraveling that no one in England could witness.
This was a group of people who showed up and were ready to settle, but what happened to that colony is one of the big unanswered questions of American history.
And when rescue finally returned, it found only careful silence, a vanished settlement, and a single carved word that hinted not at disappearance, but at a journey hidden in plain sight. To understand why that message mattered, we must return to the moment England first set its hopes on this fragile coast. A colony on the edge of hope and uncertainty. When England first looked across the Atlantic in the late 16th century, it saw both an opportunity and a warning because the New World promised wealth, power, and influence, yet demanded resilience from anyone attempting to claim it. Roanoke Island emerged as a strategic prize during this period, offering a sheltered position between the mainland and open sea, and allowing vessels to anchor, resupply, and move inland along river systems that merchants and explorers believed could unlock vast trade networks. The men who first stepped onto its shores carried ambitions far larger than the narrow strip of land before them. Yet, they also felt the unease of building Europe's future on ground that did not behave according to European expectations. Their early encounters with shifting coastlines, unpredictable storms, and the delicate politics of native alliances revealed how precarious survival could become when every decision hinged on limited information and dwindling supplies. England's leadership viewed the colony as a necessary foothold, but for the settlers themselves, Roanoke represented an experiment that might secure their families' fortunes or unravel their lives entirely, depending on forces beyond their control. These conflicting pressures shaped every choice made on the island, creating a tense foundation for the fragile community that struggled to take root. Disconnection and desperation. When Governor John White sailed back to England for supplies in 1587, he expected a routine voyage that would return him to Roanoke within months. Yet the world he left behind shifted faster than any colonial plan could survive. Political tensions across Europe intensified as Spain prepared the massive naval campaign that would become the famed Armada. And with every passing week, the Atlantic transformed from a commercial corridor into a militarized frontier. The Crown ordered English ships to remain in port, coastal defenses absorbed the nation's attention, and civilian travel collapsed beneath the weight of imminent invasion. White attempted to circumvent the restrictions by joining two smaller private vessels, yet each attempt confronted the same hostile ocean where storms, shortages, and privateers made the crossing a dangerous gamble rather than a practical journey. A French attack damaged the ship so severely that the return became impossible, forcing White to watch helplessly as the colony he had just left slipped beyond communication. Meanwhile, the settlers on Roanoke faced a different kind of uncertainty as they waited for sails that never appeared on the horizon, relying on past experience to interpret the silence not as abandonment but as a temporary interruption shaped by wartime demands. For 3 years, neither England nor the colonists received a single confirmed report of violence, disease outbreak, or foreign intrusion on the island, and the absence of such signals created a vacuum where assumptions grew stronger than facts. By the time White finally secured passage back across the Atlantic, the delay had stretched far beyond what anyone intended, establishing the conditions that would make the silent settlement he found in 1590 feel so haunting and so misunderstood in the centuries that followed. A message misunderstood. When John White stepped ashore in 1590, the scene confronting him carried none of the devastation he feared, because the settlement had not been burned, looted, or shattered by an enemy force. Instead, the structures appeared deliberately dismantled, with timbers removed in an orderly fashion and belongings conspicuously absent rather than scattered, suggesting that the colonists had not fled in panic but departed with intention. The familiar voices he expected to greet him were nowhere to be found, yet the land around him felt strangely undisturbed, as though the colony had exhaled its final breath quietly rather than violently. What captured his attention most was the carved word CROATOAN found near the settlement's center, along with the partial carving CRO on a nearby tree. These markings were not random etchings, but communicative signals shaped by a prearranged agreement between White and the settlers, who had decided before his departure that any relocation under duress must include a carved sign accompanied by a cross. The absence of that distress marker mattered profoundly because it indicated that the move was neither forced nor conducted under immediate threat. White recognized the name as referring to the homeland of the CROATOAN people on present-day Hatteras Island, a community that had long maintained cooperative ties with the English. Although the carvings offered a clear direction, White's attempt to follow the trail collapsed under the weight of an approaching storm, and a crew unwilling to risk their ships. His departure cemented the mystery, allowing later generations to misinterpret deliberate relocation as disappearance and quiet survival as an unresolved enigma. Evidence beneath the soil. Centuries after the carvings first puzzled historians, the ground beneath coastal North Carolina began revealing traces of a story far more coherent than the disappearance legend suggested, because modern archaeological teams uncovered evidence that connected the Roanoke settlers to multiple locations beyond the island itself. One of the most significant breakthroughs emerged from a reassessment of a 16th century map created by John White and scientist Thomas Harriot, where researchers at the British Museum identified a concealed fort symbol beneath a patch placed over the original parchment. That hidden mark pointed inland to a location archaeologists later designated as Site X, an area near the confluence of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers that offered defensible terrain, fertile land, and access to established indigenous trade networks. Excavations conducted by the First Colony Foundation recovered fragments of English pottery from the precise period of the colony's disappearance, and these fragments appeared alongside indigenous ceramics, stone tools, and hearth remains that indicated sustained occupation rather than transient visitation. The mixture suggested cultural blending rather than isolation, supporting the idea that a portion of the settlers integrated into existing communities instead of perishing anonymously on Roanoke Island. Further south, on present-day Hatteras Island, archaeologists uncovered an even more decisive clue in the form of hammer scale, a byproduct of ironworking that could not have been produced by local metalworking traditions. Its presence implied that an English blacksmith had worked there for a meaningful period, reinforcing accounts of cooperation between the CROATOAN people and the relocated settlers. Additional discoveries, including European copper wire and modified tools, illustrated a pattern of adaptation rather than abandonment, providing material confirmation that the settlers continued their lives beyond Roanoke in ways earlier historians had not imagined. These findings formed a continuous archaeological footprint, allowing the narrative to shift from speculation toward a grounded explanation of movement, integration, and survival. Lineages that should not exist. As archaeologists reconstructed the physical paths the colonists may have taken, genetic researchers began noticing patterns within several indigenous communities of eastern North Carolina that introduced an entirely different layer of evidence, because certain mitochondrial and autosomal markers appeared earlier than any documented English settlement other than Roanoke. These genetic signatures, found among families with deep, well-recorded regional ancestry, reflected European maternal and paternal lines that could not be explained by later colonial migrations, trade interactions, or the arrival of 17th century settlers from Jamestown. Instead, they aligned closely with haplogroups associated with 16th century English populations, indicating that intermarriage and generational blending likely began decades before England established its next permanent foothold on the continent. Although genetics alone cannot pinpoint the precise individuals involved, the temporal mismatch between these ancient European lineages and official colonial timelines suggested that descendants of Roanoke survivors became part of nearby tribal societies, contributing to family networks that endured long after the original settlement disappeared from written history. Researchers examining these patterns emphasized that the data supported a quiet, continuous presence rather than an isolated encounter, strengthening the argument that the settlers adapted to indigenous lifeways in order to preserve their families, skills, and identities under conditions where remaining on Roanoke Island would have threatened their survival. This biological evidence complemented the archaeological findings, demonstrating that the colony's legacy persisted, not only through artifacts, but also through living communities whose genealogies carried silent traces of a 16th century story previously framed as a disappearance. What survival looked like. Once the archaeological and genetic clues began aligning, a clearer portrait emerged of what daily life may have looked like for the relocated settlers, because their survival depended not on preserving the social structure they had attempted. They had attempted to build on Roanoke Island, but on integrating into communities whose knowledge of the land far exceeded their own. Indigenous societies across coastal North Carolina maintained extensive trade networks, agricultural systems, and diplomatic relationships that allowed them to navigate environmental instability with skill, and the settlers who joined them would have entered a world where cooperation shaped every aspect of life. English tools, metalwork techniques, and carpentry skills likely offered value within these communities, while indigenous traditions of farming, fishing, and seasonal mobility provided the settlers with stability they could not achieve alone. Children born into blended families would have learned multiple languages, absorbed cultural practices from both sides, and contributed to households that adapted fluidly to shifting circumstances. Over time, the distinctions that once separated the English from their hosts would have softened, creating an environment where identity was measured less by origin and more by participation in communal responsibilities. Surviving in this manner required flexibility, humility, and trust, qualities that the crisis on Roanoke Island may have cultivated more effectively than any planned colonial structure. This version of events reframed the colony not as a failed settlement erased by catastrophe, but as a small group of families who chose resilience through adaptation, blending into societies that offered them continuity when isolation threatened to end their story entirely. The settlers of Roanoke did not vanish into myth. They wove themselves into new communities whose stories endured in ways history overlooked. Their journey shows how survival reshapes identity across generations. If this perspective changed how you see the past, share your thoughts below and join us for more unfolding histories ahead.